Hello, my name's Susan Heyward and I've been working here at Gare Infant School in Newport in South Wales for the past 6 years. About 4 years ago I started using a computer in my classroom, and a year after that I was given a floor turtle. This programme is about the way the work has developed with my middle and top infants. Well, I first bought a computer about 4 years ago. It was at the time that the ZX81 had just been brought out. And my children then were 7 and 3. And it dawned on me one day that they were going to grow up in a world in which computers were part of their everyday lives, part of their bread and butter, that they'd end up probably using computers in their work, even if they didn't go into computing. And I didn't want to be completely isolated from the sort of technology that they were using as they grew up. And I just wanted to find out what computers did really, and had, as I said, a little ZX81 at home to try, and became very interested in it, and also became interested in what I thought computers could do in the classroom, because obviously that was just prior to the Department of Trade and Industry scheme, which put computers into primary schools. I did a local authority in-service training course so that I could learn a bit more about what you could do with computers in the classroom, and as part of that course I saw floor turtles being used. At the time, the Council for Educational Technology had about 90 turtles that they were putting into schools in England and Wales, and a number of them were coming to this area via the Bristol CEMERC. At the time, although I teach in an infant school, we have a partial hearing unit in the school, and at that time we also had a unit which was called an assessment unit, which was for children who were very poor ability, children who were really having severe problems, and came here for assessment before deciding whether they should go into a special school, special unit, or perhaps come into mainstream. So I applied under that scheme to the CET, wrote a brief account of what I thought I could do with computers, not just with the special children, but with mainstream as well, because obviously that's my primary responsibility. And we were given one. So I've been using a floor turtle now for about 3 years. The turtle that I use isn't particularly difficult to set up. It's connected to the computer, to the user port on the computer, which is underneath. And you do have to have a special cable to split the user port and things like that, but it's really very simple. And normally when I use it in the classroom anyway, it's on a trolley with a computer and it's just left connected. You don't have to fiddle around with it all the time. In the middle of this turtle is a grip where you can put a pen, and there's a motor that will raise or lower the pen, which obviously the children can control. I like them to do a lot of work with the turtle before they use the pen, because I think that if they have a record of what they've done, a trace of what they've done, which obviously is what the pen gives them, then they're more likely to think in terms of mistakes. They're more likely to think, oh, that was wrong, and it looks wrong, and it's a mistake. So they have that fairly late. They've had quite a bit of experience of using the turtle before I put the pen in for them. The other thing it's got is a little loudspeaker here, and it will hoot. I think the original ones that they developed in Edinburgh played Scotland the Brave, but I'm afraid I was only hoots. The children start using the floor turtle with just a few commands, and these commands are part of Turtle Graphics, which is a small part of the computer language logo. They just have a few commands to start them off. They have forwards and backwards, left and right. But to use those, they have to put a number with them, so they have to give the command some sort of value right from the start. The forwards and backwards movements are quite arbitrary. They vary from one piece of software to another, but the degrees, the numbers that they put in to turn the turtle are actually degrees. Obviously the children don't know that. You don't start talking to them in terms of degrees, but they will say turn it right 90, left 90. And the turtle itself is accurate, so that eventually they realise that to turn it all the way around they have to use 360. Well, obviously when children's starting off, especially if you're working with very young children, I work with children as young as 4 with the floor turtle, obviously they're not able to type forwards and backwards into the computer. So I start them off with a concept keyboard. It's a pressure sensitive keyboard. It's got 126 separate cells on it. You can get different models, but that's what this one has. And each of these areas can be individually programmed very simply by the teacher, so that you could program one cell or you could program the whole keyboard as one particular command. So what I do is to use a set of overlays that go on top of the concept keyboard, like that one. And the areas underneath these symbols I've programmed so that all the child has to do is to touch them and then touch that, which is programmed as a return key. They call it go, but in terms of the computer it's a return. And that will put the commands into the computer. So right at the outset they're not typing in any commands, and at that stage they're not using any numbers either. They're just getting to know the commands that I've already put onto the overlay. And obviously the overlays build up, so they gradually become more complicated. I gradually introduce more and more commands. I'll put that one on instead. That one's got 3 forward movements. It happens to be 50, 100 and 150. 3 backward movements, the same numbers, and 3 turns, which are 90 degrees, 60 and 30. When I first started off, I didn't have a return key programmed in the middle. I just let the children, I put a return onto the end of each of the commands, so the child just pressed the command and the turtle executed that particular action. But I put a return key on in the middle because I found that they weren't really taking in what was happening. That they weren't really thinking about the processes. It all happened before they realised. I've also got a delete key on this one and hoot, which they seem to like. I've talked to teachers about using concept keyboard before now, not just with Turtle, but with other things like word processing. And as soon as you say you program the concept keyboard, they are absolutely horrified and they assume that it's a very complicated process. But in fact, it's not. To do an overlay like this takes perhaps 10 or 15 minutes. And there are utilities like Star Set is one that you can use that present on screen a simulation of the concept keyboard, and you just type into the computer what you want that area of the concept keyboard to be. And obviously the advantage of it from a teacher's point of view is that all that the child has is the information that you want them to have, whether it's a symbol, whether it's words, whether it's numbers, whatever it is. It's a dedicated keyboard, and you've cut out all the clutter, you've cut out all the extra keys that they don't need to use. So for young children, it's a really good way of letting them put information into a computer. Well, obviously when you're using a floor turtle, you're using quite expensive equipment, you're taking up a lot of space, and it takes quite a long time too, so it's not worth doing unless you really think that the benefits are worth the investment in time and energy and so on. I think the most important thing is, obviously for young children particularly, they have to be actively involved in their learning. And the sort of learning that develops when children are actively involved is so much better than learning by rote or learning because it's something you've told them. That's essential. The learning is something that they make for themselves too, that a child who draws a square with a floor turtle may be able to recognise a square when he takes a square out of a box of shapes. But when he draws it, he has to really think about what a square is, and he makes that part of his own intellectual framework almost. He makes it part of his own understanding mathematically and of the world around him, and that's very important. It's learning by doing. And that came in very early with floor turtles. That's really why floor turtles were developed initially, because their originator was so influenced by the work of Piaget in terms of the child building his own intellectual structures. So that's obviously very important. It's a very good cooperative exercise too. Children have to work together. There's a lot of discussion that comes out. And the important thing about that is that children are arguing very often, sometimes fighting, and they're discussing mathematical ideas. But they're not discussing mathematical ideas because I've told them to, or because they're things that I think are important. They're almost fighting their corner. As an example, I once saw three boys who'd drawn a triangle. Now, it wasn't a regular triangle. When you show children triangles, you tend to show them equilateral triangles, isosceles triangles, regular shapes. And something that's irregular, they often don't recognise as a triangle. These 3 boys had drawn a triangle, it wasn't regular, and they were arguing about it. And the one child said, no, it's not a triangle. It obviously didn't look like the triangles in their box of shapes. But another child said, yes, it's got 3 sides, and so it's got to be a triangle. And they were arguing because it mattered to them, not because it mattered to me. Obviously, when children are discussing things, it's not only that it matters to them, but they do begin to use mathematical vocabulary more and more accurately. The children who start off saying, the turtle's looking where he's going, we'll soon be saying it's moving forwards, it's turning left and so on, and that's obviously important. Another thing that comes out of it, again for young children, which is important, is that they begin to use numbers accurately. They begin to manipulate large numbers. Very often when you're talking to young children, they don't know that 1,000 is bigger than 100. I mean, 100 is a big number. But they begin to say, oh, the turtle won't go so far next time, 100 will be too much, or 70 is too big, let's find a smaller number. Or even something like, it'll need to go half as far, so it'll have to go 20 instead of 40. So they really do begin to assign value and meaning to large numbers, which is something that is obviously very difficult to give to young children. I've heard some people argue that when you're using floor turtles with young children, you should scale it down so that they don't have to use big numbers. Now, I think in theory that sounds like a good sort of argument, but in fact they do use large numbers and they use them well. So if we can provide them an opportunity to do that, then that seems to me a much better way of working. The numbers that they need to use are large and they use them, so there doesn't seem to be any problem with it at all. When children are working with the floor turtle, they take it very seriously. You can think of a floor turtle as being in two different ways. You can think of it as a control device, something that the children are controlling. And you can think of it as being a concrete representation of a screen turtle. So it's a concrete realization of something that could be represented on screen in 2 dimensions. And I think it's the control aspect of it that makes it so important to children. And children do take it very seriously. Even very young children realize that they're using quite sophisticated equipment and they thrive on it. They really do develop self-esteem with it. I can remember one little girl, only a reception child, and a young reception child at that, a kid of about 4, and she was working just outside my door with a floor turtle, and another child went past. She was using the concept keyboard with the overlay, and another child went past and said, oh, you're not really controlling that, it's only a bit of paper, meaning the overlay. And she whipped the paper off and she said, look, there's numbers underneath. And it was important to her, young as she was, that she was controlling the turtle. And I think that's one of the things that they learn very early on. They learn cause and effect, that the commands that they're putting into the computer are moving the turtle. Now that's obviously a very important piece of learning from the point of view of computers in general, well, and the world in general. And one thing is that many of the concepts that they will acquire later, they can acquire much earlier. I think a good example of this with the floor turtle is the concept of angle. The idea of being able to measure turn, which is quite a sophisticated idea, and it's an idea that normally they would meet much later. But children begin to talk in terms of a big turn or a small turn. They do acquire the understanding that you can measure turn just as you can measure distance, and obviously that's important. Obviously all this work, they can relate to their own body knowledge. They develop their spatial awareness, and the way that the turtle moves, they can relate to the way that their own body moves in space. In fact, that's one of the ways you start, really. You start by, well, I start by programming them and letting them program me, so that they build up the idea of a series of commands, putting commands into a computer and giving instructions accurately and listening to instructions accurately and interpreting instructions accurately. That's something that's quite important. One of the things I feel very strongly about with the floor turtles, one of the opportunities that you can offer children is the opportunity to plan. We're always talking about the need to develop planning skills, and it's certainly something as adults that we need. But with young children, it's very difficult to give them opportunities to plan. They don't really plan much at all. Occasionally they might, thinking in school terms now, occasionally they might plan some movement in PE. They might plan a model or a construction toy. But I suspect that on the whole they don't. On the whole, construction toys and models tend to grow. You don't start off with a clear idea of what you're going to do. But one thing you can do with a floor turtle is ask them to plan a series of commands that will move the turtle from one place to another, move it around a floor mat, make it do a particular thing. And children can record that and then try it out and then go back and make any adjustments or any changes that they need. So it really is, I think, one of the very few opportunities that we have to give young children as young as 5 or 6, the opportunity to plan something before they do it. There's another aspect to that as well. I think you can do a certain amount of planning with construction toys. But the problem is that if you have, say, 3 children working together on a construction toy that will do a particular thing, on a construction model, they can't at the outset share an idea of what that's going to be. But with a turtle they can. They 3 children working together, if they have to go from here to there across a zigzag track, they are all working on the same model at the outset. And they're able to share their ideas, obviously, and they are able to record their ideas. One of the other things that young children can do when they're working with a floor turtle is begin to take some sort of responsibility for their own learning. As soon as they've learned how to control the turtle, as soon as they've done a bit of basic playing and working with it, they can set their own challenges. Now, very often I found that children will set themselves far more difficult tasks than I would set for them. I mean, I think perhaps that says something about teachers underestimating what children can do. I'm sure that happens. I've had experience of drawing chalk tracks on the floor for children to follow with the turtle, and then saying at the end of it, well, you can extend the track, make it longer. And I find that children set themselves much more difficult things to do than I'd set for them at the outset. When they start drawing, they always come up with really quite difficult things to draw, like a circle. Children always want to draw a circle with a turtle, which is quite a difficult thing to do and involves a lot of absolutely basic thinking about geometry and really does develop their understanding. Obviously, if children are taking more responsibility for what they're doing, young children taking more responsibility, then that involves a certain amount of change of role for the teacher. You haven't got all the answers. They are working things out for themselves, perhaps. And for some teachers, that may involve some risk. You have to let children make mistakes sometimes, and that's not always easy to do. You want to prevent them making mistakes. But as long as those aren't too damaging, as long as it's part of the way that they're learning, then sometimes you just have to stand back and watch and intervene, perhaps, but not provide the answers. And that isn't always easy. I've been working on floor turtle in my own classroom for 2 or 3 years now and developed materials that I've used myself with the children, tried out, obviously. And fortunately, I was offered secondment to the microelectronics unit in Cardiff, but funded by MESU, to develop materials for other teachers to use. There's another teacher in North Wales who's been seconded as well. He teaches top juniors. So what we're producing is a pack of materials that will go right through from 4 to 11 and 11 plus if the secondary schools are interested. The pack contains materials used with floor turtle. They're materials very similar to the ones that I've used in my own classroom and tried out. There are concept keyboard overlays, big floor mats to drive the turtle around, which will tie in with the sort of themes that you use for projects in infants and lower juniors. And then there are some screen turtle materials, reference cards and challenge cards, ideas to set children working, and those will go right through the junior school and obviously take children right through turtle graphics. I hope that the materials will enable anyone to have a go at turtle graphics and to start their children off with Logo. Teachers often find it very difficult to use computers. They assume that there are going to be all sorts of problems involved. But I've used the materials myself, and I think they're so straightforward that anyone can really start the work. It really is very easy to use turtle graphics, and I found that once you get going, it's the children's enthusiasm that carries you along, because they want to do it, they're so keen. And once they get going, once you develop that sort of momentum, very often you're having to keep up with them rather than them keep up with you, but it's a very exciting way of working.